Hello bearded bee people, welcome back to Being KBs for another episode of our beekeeping crash course. Today we're going to talk about feeding your bees. Let's just get right into it. There are two different feeds, two different types of food that you're going to end up having to supply to your bees at one time or another, and that would be sugar and protein. So naturally, bees acquire nectar from flowers and make honey from it, and that is what we're trying to mimic when we're applying sugar to our hives. But they also bring back pollen from flowers, depending on what the flower offers to them, and that is where they get their protein. So we have to be able to supplement both of those because of the fact that we don't necessarily always have the greatest conditions for our bees, and because of the fact that we're really just trying to give our bees the absolute best opportunity at survival and prosperity. So first we're going to talk about feeding sugar, but there are a couple of things to keep in mind that may seem sort of illogical or counterintuitive, and that is white granulated sugar is essential. You have to have the white granulated sugar. The sugar in the raw, although it may seem to your mind to be more natural and probably better for your bees, it's in fact not better for your bees at all, because the stuff that is in that sugar in the raw or molasses are like burnt plant solids that have a really bad effect on our bees' digestive systems. So you have to feed white granulated sugar, and then your choice of that is either cane sugar or beet sugar. Now that's a decision you can make for yourself. The difference to your bees, there isn't one. It is almost pure sucrose at that point. So I choose beet sugar because it's cheaper and because it doesn't have any effect on tropical countries. We've got tons and tons of beets around us here. So that is my preferred sugar type. And as far as where I get it where it's cheapest, which is usually, honestly, Sam's Club or Walmart. So, and then as far as, well, we'll talk about protein here in a little bit. So we're going to talk about feeding sugar. Another idea or another thing to keep in mind is that when you're making your syrup, and we'll talk about the consistencies of the syrup here in a second, but when you're making your syrup, obviously we have to have hot water to dissolve all of the sugar, but really only hot enough to dissolve the sugar is best, because if you start to boil that sugar and change the sucrose molecule and start to decompose that sucrose molecule, it can change the molecular compound and once again have a really bad effect on your bee's digestive system. So we really just want to heat it just barely enough to melt the sugar into the water and then let it cool and feed it to your bees. So you're going to need to feed sugar a couple of different times throughout the year, probably, to your bees, and that would be mainly in the spring and the fall. And we change up the consistency of the sugar to sort of better mimic what we're trying to, mimic for our bees. So in the spring, we feed thinner stuff, usually around 1-to-1 sugar to water by weight. In the fall, or the reason that we feed the thinner stuff like that in the spring is because we're trying to mimic the nectar to get these bees into build-up and growth mode. So right about now is when we usually start feeding sugar, or feeding the thin syrup. And then in the fall, we don't want the bees bringing in that much water. We really want them to bring it in and store it as if it's honey. So we make it thicker to better mimic honey. And to do that, we use a 2-to-1 sugar to water by weight ratio. Once again, just don't boil it, don't overheat it. Heat it enough to dissolve the sugar, stir like crazy, and you'll be good. So, now we know that we have to feed the thin stuff in the spring and the thick stuff in the fall. How do we apply that sugar to our bees? Well, there are two different types of feeding when you're talking about sugar, and that is spot feeding, or feeding inside the hive, or communal feeding, feeding outside the hive to whichever hives may be nearby. First, we will talk about spot feeding. Okay, so the majority of people who start off in bees start off with a feeder like this This is called a Boardman entrance feeder. It's super cheap and it works, but there are problems with it aplenty. And that the main problems that I see are that the jar can only hold so much liquid, and so you're really having to visit your bees more than once per day during the build-up portion of the year to refill the liquid. The other problem that I have with it is that you have to set it right at the entrance of the hive. And if you've kept bees for a little while or been around bees or understand their nature, you'll understand that it is a problem to place enticing food right at the entrance of a hive, especially if that hive has a diminished capacity to defend, which is a likely situation early on in the spring when they're trying to build up. So I do not like the use of these. Obviously I own them because we used to use them when we had only a few hives, but now I use something different and I recommend you do the same. So what we do now for spot feeding, for the most part, we use these frame replacement feeders. These are great in the sense that you don't have to have it anywhere near the entrance or outside the hive at all. It will hold more than a gallon, and it just takes up the place of a single frame on the inside of the hive. What I do with them, you know, they sell fancy ones with floats, but I think that's unnecessary. What I do is I fill them about a third of the way with pine straw or regular straw, and then fill it up the rest of the way with syrup. That straw will float up to the top and offer a surface for the bees to walk on while they're drinking it, and it will sink down with the syrup as it gets drained, preventing any bees from being drowned. So get these without any added, you know, ladders or gimmicks or whatever, and just use the pine straw or straw in it to prevent the drowning, and these will work really, really well for you. And they're cheap. They're as cheap as the Boardman entrance feeders. So this is my recommendation for feeding inside the hive. As far as communal feeding, feeding outside the hive to whichever hives may be nearby, my main method at this point is Ian Stepler's large Rubbermaid feeder tub. And so for this, it's just a large Rubbermaid that we cut with a Dremel tool some windows on either side, and it's filled with straw, once again about a third of the way. That allows for you to pour in up to like 20 gallons of syrup. I mean, you can just load it up and the bees can fly in through those windows and they'll drain it really quickly. It's a super effective and super easy method of feeding a bunch of hives really, really quickly. Another method that I have for communal feeding are the communal feeder buckets, and I have a video on exactly that. If you search how to make a communal feeder bucket, B&K Bees, on YouTube, you'll find it, but I'll talk about it here in just a second. Okay, so a feeder bucket is just a 5-gallon bucket with holes poked with a screwdriver at places that coincide with these little reservoirs that run around the rim here. So what you do is, after poking those holes, being sure to not poke any holes that coincide with a part that has a hole on it, because then it'll just continue to drain out. But if you poke the holes in the right spots and cover it with a lid and flip it over, the liquid will start to drain into these reservoirs at the end or on the rim of the bucket, and it will draw a vacuum at the top, preventing it from continuing to drain. And so the bees can kind of line up around the edge of the bucket and drink it, and as it's drank, it will, you know, drain out just enough to fill these reservoirs and keep it from draining all over the ground. Now, those are finicky. You know, you have to have a really good lid, and it's a bummer when you're buying bunches of sugar in the fall to get your bees up to weight, only to see a bucket just drain all over the ground because it didn't seal correctly. But you do not have that issue at all with these. So this is my go-to at this point. I don't think I've used a feeder bucket for the last... Okay, so people think... Generally, a lot of people on the internet will warn you against communal feeding because of the threat of robbing. Now, the idea here is obviously to put it in a general area of the yard, maybe 100 yards away from the nearest hive. And if you do that, then you're not going to have any issue with robbing. But if you do put it next to a single hive, especially if that's a smaller hive in comparison to the nearby ones, then you might entice a robbing situation. So definitely put your communal food, 100 yards away from the nearest hive, and you won't have any issues. An issue that does exist inherently in communal feeding is trying to get the weights up in the fall. It's difficult with this style of feeder because of the fact that the hives that really need it aren't ever the ones that get it. It's always the largest hives, the hives that had the ability to get the most honey during the year, have the ability to get the most communal feed as well. So when it comes to fall feeding, I do some communal feeding, but for the bulk of it, for the light hives that I have to get up to weight, I do inside the hive feeding. I use an old school method for my singles, I use a method that I came up with for my singles called the Hillbilly Hive Top Feeder, where I put a container, a feeder bucket up above the inner cover and surrounded by a shell box so that I don't have to take the space of an extra frame up inside the hive, because in singles that space is needed to have a frame of honey. So if you have a double, don't worry about that. You can continue to use these. But if you have a single, check out my Hillbilly Hive Top Feeder video. I guess I can explain it a little bit more here. Okay, so I use these types of feeders. I hate them, and I'm trying to get away from this because they do not last very long. But I take this and I fill it up once again with pine straw or straw, and I put it above the inner cover. So imagine this has an inner cover on it with a slot right in the center. I'll put a couple sticks over the slot to make sure that this doesn't completely seal that off. And then I'll set this on there with pine straw, and I'll pour syrup into it, and then I'll put an empty shell box around it and put the lid on. This is essentially a hive top feeder where the only extra piece of equipment you have to buy is a dollar store baking pan. It works really well, but if you've got a bunch of hives and you want to keep these feeders for years and years, the dollar store baking pan just doesn't cut it. So once again, my inside the hive feeder recommendation to you is a frame replacement feeder. My communal feeder recommendation to you is a big old Rubbermaid with a couple of windows cut off on the sides. All right, and then here on this slide, you see this Hillbilly Hive Top Feeder. I could have just flipped that to that before I explained it all, but here it is pretty well displayed for you. You see that it's surrounded by that shell box, and like I said, it's up on sticks to make sure that the feeder container doesn't seal off the hole in the inner cover. Okay, and then feeding pollen. I don't feed pollen too often to my bees because generally our bees have way more than enough natural protein available. But when I do the powdered stuff. I know in this slide it shows a patty. That was at least 5 years ago. Since then, I've kind of fallen out of love with the patties because I realized that when the bees do start getting fresh pollen, they tend to ignore the patty. And when they start to ignore the patty, that allows for small hive beetles and other pests to sort of take safe haven in and around it. So for that reason, I just like to stick to the powdered stuff. And for the powdered stuff, I like to apply it to each yard in a PVC pipe. So a short PVC pipe with a cap on one end, fill it up about a third of the way with the powder, set it horizontally somewhere in your yard, and those bees will fly into the PVC pipe, gain a static charge from the plastic, and come out just covered with that with that pollen substitute. So if you are feeding the patties, though, be mindful of the fact that if they do ignore it, it can become a safe haven for pests. But really, if you're going to feed pollen, do it in the spring, and then other than in the spring, do it when necessary. Because if your bees have a bunch of bee bread inside their hive, they are probably not in need of it. I do feed pollen to all of my cell builders, though. If they're building queen cells, too much protein is not a thing. So they always have pollen patties on them if they're building queen cells. But, unless you're doing that stuff, I recommend you stick to the powdered stuff because it's easier and it just doesn't bring any type of threat inside your hive. So that's it. Next up will be maintaining a queen right hive, which is obviously really important stuff to be able to understand and be able to do. So I hope you guys are digging it. Thank you very much for watching. Get out there and have some fun with your bees. See ya.